I get to welcome our next speaker, Bob Weisenmiller, as an energy policy expert and the former chair of the California Energy Commission. Bob, it's good to see you again. And
yes, very good to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, welcome virtually back to campus.
So I'm going to talk today about California's climate and energy policies. And as Neil indicated, I was the chair of the California Energy Commission throughout Governor Brown's last term. If you go on to the next slide, actually the Energy Commission was passed and signed by Governor Reagan and then implemented by Governor Brown at a time when he was the youngest governor in California history. Obviously, at the end, he was the oldest governor in California history. I got to serve under him as a staffer in the 70s and then as his chair more recently. And the Energy Commission, again, is responsible for developing energy policy, very strong emphasis on energy efficiency, but also a very strong emphasis on siting power plants, certainly encouraging energy efficiency, renewables, always has to be prepared for energy emergencies, and particularly in the last 10 or 20 years has been more involved in transforming transportation. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to cover two things today. One is climate change, which is the basic question of why are we as focused in California as we are on climate issues, and then how that translates into California's climate energy policies. So going to the next slide, and then go to the next slide after that. This was a quote, for 2018, this quote from the New York Times, that was the year when we started living climate change rather than just studying it. And there's no time to wait. That at the end of that year, I went to Paradise after the fires, and it really drove home the message that, yeah, things had changed and we really needed to focus on addressing climate change right away. Let's go to the next slide. That's been reiterated by the IPCC's reports. There's been a couple this year. I'm going to talk about the first one a little bit more detail, but in August of 2021, Secretary General said, Code Red for humanity. Climate change is here and now. Humans are responsible. Humans have added enough GHG to warm the climate by about 1.5 degrees Celsius. The majority of these warmings is tied to carbon dioxide and methane emissions, and very important given methane's characteristics of superwarming gas to reduce methane now. Let's go to the next slide. This is, again, the February report from the IPCC, but its basic message was, again, climate emergency. Just hitting a couple of quick points, but one is that over the next decade, we need to invest 3 to 6 times more in clean energy and cutting emissions. But also the cost of inactions are significant, that in the United States last year, damages from floods, wildfires, drought, and other disasters related to climate and weather totaled $145 billion. So really having a substantial impact right now. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that we did at the Energy Commission, this is actually a joint report of the Energy Commission, the Resources Agency, and OPR, is we did the California's 4th climate change assessment. These are updated every 5 years. So there's another one. The 5th one is now in progress. And as you heard from the last speaker, there's a lot of uncertainty, but the basic message is that California's future looks hotter, drier, and that obviously has implications for fire hazards. But, again, this is an area we'll talk a little bit more about later, where obviously there's a lot of interesting science to deal with here. But again, we went through and sort of tried to model with the best scientists in the state, about 40, what the future looked like. If you go to the next slide, California has had to deal with wildfire, I'm going to say forever. And as you can tell, this chart goes through and talks about the top 20 deadliest, most destructive, and largest fires. And as you can tell, we've had fires since the 30s. Actually, again, this is looking at the top 20. So you can see fires going back to, again, ever since we've been here. But you can also see there's a very strong concentration in recent years. And in fact, when you go through that, the basic message is there's a real change of scale going on, and that wildfires are becoming a much more dangerous phenomena now. Again, not that they haven't always been there, but just when you look at the concentration of deaths, destruction, and surface area, the clear message is now's the time to really worry about that. So again, real motivation for us to address climate change, particularly in California, particularly from wildfires. Let's go to the next slide. So now again, I'm just going to transition over to climate energy policy. I mean, how do we respond to these reality? Let's go to the next slide. So again, and some of this, thank God that you had Jared here today, since it allows me to sort of shorten some of the parts of my presentation. But so California has certainly had greenhouse gas reduction goals. This goes back to, the first one to achieve 1990 levels, which we did by 2016. This came out of AB 32, signed by Governor Schwarzenegger. 2030, it's our next big goal, is to reduce 40% below 1990 levels. That comes out of SB 32. That's work in progress. 2045, Governor Brown has an executive order to go to zero net carbon by 2045. And we talked, again earlier about one of the other aspects is now we're on a legally have a goal of 100% renewable power, which obviously will then translate back into greenhouse gas reductions. Going to the next slide, this is a basic message that, in the Brown administration, I was sort of on point on China, so it was going there once or twice a year, Germany, other places, Mexico. But the basic message that this demonstrates is that California has shown that it's possible to grow the economy at the same time it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, either total emissions or per capita or per GDP. And obviously, we have a very vibrant economy, the 5th largest in the world at this stage. I don't quite know how COVID has affected some of those statistics, but bottom line is that there's a clear demonstration that California demonstrates that you can grow your economy at the same time you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So going to the next slide, obviously, what you have to do is focus on your inventory of greenhouse gas emissions and then set your policies around that. And having said that, California has its own inventory. It's not like the policies that we use are necessarily going to be the priorities for other states or countries. But for California, and again, high-level takeaway, basic message is transportation. That if you look at direct transportation, it's a little under 40%. If you include basically production and refining of gasoline and diesel, you get to 52%. So 52% of California's greenhouse gas emissions are for transportation. So bottom line is, as you come up with programs to address greenhouse gas emissions, transportation is the heart and center of stuff. You can see electricity is about 15%. Just about everything we do involves greenhouse gas emissions. But again, for California, top of the list is transportation and moving away from greenhouse gas emissions there. Going to the next slide. So how do we plan to do that? That comes back to the scoping plan. Again, you've heard that term used by a couple of people today. Governor Brown used it, Jared used it. And this is an ARB document. It is updated every 5 years. And 208 set the target for 2020. 2014, which I was obviously very involved in the Brown administration, set looked on progress to date and short-lived climate. And then 2017 came up with the target for 2030. I would note Mary Nichols was actually the driver of the 208, 2014, and 2017, did a masterful job on that. But anyway, we now have a transition. 2022 is the new document. It's in progress now. There's a draft out. And again, now we'll look at progress on 2030 and plan to meet the 2045 goal. And additionally, another part of the scoping plan really, having said transportation is the big thing, the ARB also has out advanced clean car regulation, which is up for adoption in 2022. So going to the next slide, again, I'm not going to spend much time on this since Jared also hit it. Governor Newsom set a goal for zero emission cars by 2035. This is the ARB's plan to come up with that. Again, last year we had about 16% of our sales in California were clean cars. These regulations are up for adoption in August. They include a lot of pieces, but again, this is very critical. Going to the next slide. This looks more at the 2017 climate policies. Again, I'm a little more familiar. This deals with how we at least set for 2030, doubling building energy efficiency, 50% renewables, basically cleaner transportation, cap and trade, and dealing with super pollutants, and also protecting and managing natural and working land. So anyway, it's a very broad portfolio of activities that Mary came up with and adopted. This is now what's going in place, and certainly the next scoping plan will refine this and look at how to move forward. Going to the next slide. So the draft, and again, I'm going to really try to keep this very short, but basically, again, it's got a carbon neutrality goal, and part of that is a new focus on natural and working lands and also technology for carbon capture and storage. Basic reduction of greenhouse gases, but also a major shift away from petroleum, 91% below 2022 by 2045. And as with anything, it has to balance cost effectiveness, health, and technological feasibility, but a real emphasis too on reducing fossil fuel use to decrease the impact on low-income communities' color. Go to the next slide. In terms of the tools, and again, this is something which the Secretary covered. Again, fossil fuel transportation, key part of this, phase out of natural gas in buildings and homes, clamp down on emissions, substantial renewables and batteries, tightening cap and trade, tightening the low carbon fuel standard, scaling up hydrogen, but also, like I said, very interesting details on natural working lands and carbon capture and storage. So again, let's go to the next slide. Governor Newsom has had substantial programs, and again, this was talked about earlier by Jared, so I'm going to keep it at a very high level, but he had major investment of about $15 billion last year in climate. This year in the January budget, he proposed $22.5 billion, including 9.1 for transportation programs, 3 for clean energy innovation. As you can see, the other big pieces here. And then when you look at the next slide, in fact, with the May revise, he increased even more. And so this is about another $9.5 billion, including drought, resilience, and response, but also about $5 billion for dealing with basically strategic reliability assets, increase in distributed backup, residential, solar, and storage, but also dealing with existing payments. So as with the CAR plan, as with the scoping plan, now with the budget, we don't know the details, and we're not going to know the details until things are reached conclusions in Sacramento. But we have major commitments in all three that will certainly affect what California can do in the next 10 years. Well, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so basic message is we have about 28 million cars. We have about 1 million trucks. Again, 52% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation, but also 83% of the criteria pollutants are from transportation. We have severe non-attainment areas for ozone, LA Basin, and also in San Joaquin, just north. Petroleum consumption, 14.5 billion gallons of gasoline, 3.6 billion gallons of diesel. So again, transportation is a key issue we have to confront. Flipping to the next slide here. So we have two aspects of it. One is vehicle infrastructure, which by that I mean charging infrastructure or hydrogen refueling, and also basically the zero emissions fleet. Anyway, no one's really going to shift over to electric vehicles unless the charging is there. And at the same time, no one, it's going back to when I was first at the commission, no one was going to build the charging infrastructure unless the vehicles were there. So at this point, we have about 730,000 plug-in electric vehicles, about 1 million zero-emission vehicles generally, 7,000 hydrogen. And the state is putting substantial investments in both the charging infrastructure and also the fleets by incentives, so we can get to this basic target of 100% in-state sales by 2035. Let's go to the next slide. So low carbon fuel standard is part of the transportation story. CAFE standard, so we're not just electrifying the fleet, but we're also going to a more efficient fleet. We had basically coming out of the Trump era, this is actually an area of warfare between California and DC. We are now working smoothly with the Biden EPA. We worked out separate agreements with the 5 automakers. So I think the transportation stuff is moving. I would also point out the need for electrification of goods movement and shore power. Obviously, LA and Long Beach are both huge centers for goods movement into the United States, and it's very important to electrify the goods movement there. Let's go to the next slide. Basically, cap and trade has been one of the key tools for how we've addressed greenhouse gas emissions. This certainly what we found in the 2017 scoping plan is cap and trade is 4 times less costly than other alternatives, covers 80% of the state's emissions. Cap and trade, basically have AB 398 says to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for oil and gas extraction. And it's generated actually more than $10 billion for California's climate investments. And 50% of those investments are targeting disadvantaged communities. So again, cap and trade is an important element of how we are moving forward. Go to the next slide. Renewables is another key part. And again, I'm looking at the 10-year picture. You can see that California's had a long history of renewables going back to Governor Brown's first terms. But at the same time, we've really had a growth in wind and solar, both behind the meter and utility scale in the last 10 years. And that's really important to continue increasing that as part of the electrification of the grid and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. Let's go to the next slide. So in fact, as an example of that, the PUC has a pending order that the utilities are to procure 11,500 megawatts of new resources between 2023 and 2026. And these are all basically clean resources. And this is the largest procurement the PUC has ordered. We're talking about a couple thousand megawatts in 2023, 6,000 in 2024, additional 1,525, additional 2,000 in 2026. So very substantial commitment. These were designed to replace both Diablo Canyon and some of the thermal power plants. And again, the goal was to reduce UEG emissions to 38 million tons per year by 2030. And this goes on top of what already the PUC had ordered for procurement. So let's go to the next slide. And one of the things that basically this is an Energy Commission product where SB 100 asked us to basically model whether it's possible for California to have a 100% renewable grid. And the answer was the Energy Commission study concluded it is possible. Obviously, we're going to need to add a lot more renewable resources. We're going to need to basically add more storage, and we'll need some technology advancements, and we're going to need at least some natural gas capacity in the near term as we go through this transition. Presumably, this analysis will be updated in future years as we get and allows some degree of adjustments. Let's go to the next slide. So storage is, again, a big part of the answer or the puzzle, where lithium-ion batteries are used both for ZEVs and in the grid. The costs have come down substantially in the last 10 years. The price, issues are now changing. Prices are coming down a little bit. Prices have come down, but there are now supply chain issues, and certainly we're finding out some other issues. Batteries on the California grid, about 200 in 2020. A couple thousand megawatts more were added by 2021. Another couple thousand is supposed to be online by now. But again, those incidents, we've had a couple fires at Moss Landing. We've had some fires out of state. And there's a new movie that's been an ISO, Energy Commission and PUC movie that really goes into detail about what California's doing or has done on the battery side. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that's been very important to California's energy efficiency. I've talked about renewables, I've talked about batteries, talked about transportation. But California, I mean, going back to the first Brown administration, energy efficiency is one of our keystones. And as you can tell, we are going back from the 70s to now, we are much more energy efficient in terms of electricity demand per capita than the US as a whole. And that's been part of our secret to our success. Let's go to the next slide. There's been a couple of things the Energy Commission has done specifically. One is building standards, and these are, again, have to be cost effective on a life cycle basis. These are done, well, there's like 20, 30 zones within the state dealing with the fact that obviously your optimal housing design is different in the middle of the desert than it is in the middle of San Francisco. But anyway, so there's been all that adaptation. But in 2018, this was in my last year, we required that all new residential homes have basically photovoltaics for low-rise residential. And we also started shifting more from, at this point, most of the existing California buildings have gas for space and water, starting to shift that over to basically electric. 2022, again, extended that further. That this time through the Energy Commission and the building standard adoption really framed everything around GHG and not just energy usage and cost savings. And it adopted all electric performance baselines for high-rise residential and commercial. And it adopted solar PV and storage for non-residential buildings. And it also required, regardless of what's put in, that everything has to be electric ready. So let's shift to the next slide. Other key California tool has been appliance standards. And again, we started that in the 70s. The federal government started that in the 80s. The federal government preempts us. These standards, appliance standards, again, must be cost effective over the life cycle. And these cover both energy and water. And they cover sales in California. The recent law will direct the Energy Commission to include flexible load capability. Let's go to the next slide. Well, this shows you, these were more actually in my era in terms of what the standards were covering, but you can tell we did televisions, we did lamps, we did computers and monitors, we did battery chargers. And we also went back, I mean, obviously the drought's been around for a while, looking at toilets, urinals, faucets, sprays, eventually trying to tighten up on the water side too. But again, these have been a key part of California's plan in the past and will certainly be a key part of going forward. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to try to wrap things up at this point with a couple of high-level conclusions. Again, first, California has demonstrated it's possible to both grow the economy and decrease carbon emissions. Energy efficiency has been a key part of how we flatten the growth and gross state product per capita. Increased renewables and energy efficiency have reduced greenhouse gas emissions on the power grid, from 20 to 15%. In spite of our electrification efforts, transportation's greenhouse gas and criteria pollutants have been certainly heading more stable. The scoping plan, the ARB expresses some concern about they've not made as much progress on mileage as they had hoped. But changing climate really compounds the challenge through wildfire emissions. And further innovation will be required to achieve zero net carbon by 2045. Let's go to the next slide. Couple of issues that really, what I would say, outstanding issues. First of all, when you look back at the really detailed greenhouse gas inventory of the ARB, it doesn't not include emissions from wildfires. And part of the question is, well, what would a more comprehensive inventory suggest? Obviously, one of the things that's important going forward, looking at the scoping plan, is carbon storage and how would that work in the natural working lands and in the technology part. As California wildfires keep getting worse, what are the best mitigation measures? What's the impact of the public power safety shutoffs? Climate assessment has really flagged some of the emerging issues, but given California's size and the evolving science, and again, wildfires, et cetera, what are the real cumulative impacts? And what will be the cumulative impacts of changing climate on loads. Again, was the commission, I was trying to build that into the demand forecast. They've tried to step up again and build in what climate change means for loads. But, again, we have to really take into account the changing world in both looking at energy efficiency or renewables, but also in terms of trying to get to zero net carbon. Storage is a real game changer, but what are the solutions to safety issues and long-term storage capability? I know in Germany, they talk a lot about needing 10 days worth of storage. Well, we've got like 4 hours in lithium batteries. So how do we really come up with a portfolio of storage technologies that can cover not just short-term, but cover what all of our needs are? Can we electrify everything without grid reliability issues, particularly with changing climate? And then what are the social dimensions for this transition and the impacts of environmental justice on the transition? I think at this point, I will stop for questions.
Thank you, Bob. That was a great presentation overview of all of the work that's been going on in California here, really put a focus on how we've been trying to lead in this space. We have time maybe to answer one quick question. So I don't know if you were on earlier, we had Saul Griffith talking about some of the differences between Australia and the United States. And one of the ones he highlighted was that they've done a lot of work in Australia to reduce the paperwork and cost of permitting, the so-called soft costs of getting solar installed on rooftops. What would be some of the challenges that are standing in the way, or how can we accelerate something like that in California to further reduce the cost of distributed solar?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, actually, there were two aspects we tended to focus on. One was on the distributed. A lot of those decisions are, I'm going to say, at a local level. And so as you go through, I mean, the reality is from the state side, you can be pushing everyone to move forward. And certainly there's been legislation to do that. But at some point, it comes down to, okay, what does Pasadena do for its land use planning? And how does that contrast or compare with, say, Sacramento? And how do you simplify that? So in a way, it's a ground up. I was going to say, the other thing which we spent a lot of time on was just for the utility scale projects, trying to work with the feds, trying to do things to really simplify the large scale permitting. And again, that's something which easily can take a couple of years. But I mean, I did one project like in 60 days. But, again, you need to have the right site, the right technology, just everything has to fit together smoothly through the utility scale. But again, for the local stuff, you've got to be sensitive to local community values at the same time you're doing the push. But in a way, as I said, the state has tried to really encourage the locals. But I'm going to say a lot of that decision-making is going to be more at the local level.
Okay, so sort of a difference in how we regulate at a different scale of government than maybe some other places do.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you again, Bob. It was a great presentation. We're at our time for the next speaker. So I really appreciate you sharing these insights with us.